Memory transcription subject. Chief Hunter Isith, Arxa Rebellion Command. Date. Standardized human time. March 10th, 2137. 20,000 foes remained active in the system. I wasn't sure how the Terrans planned to gain the Dwerten Shield's compliance with their plans. If the local remnants, figuring at about half of the invading forces' tally, surged toward the Kolshians, it would make our support much more effective. Their motivation for aggressive action was obvious, with Kalkwa rocked by antimatter bombs. Planetary defenses were long since gone, and our rescue operation was the only reason their last remaining forces hadn't been cut down by overwhelming opposition. The Yotul's particle beams gave us a chance, especially since they lacked the recharging requirements of plasma weaponry. Enemy drones had invested their focus on the technocracy's pesky vessels, giving the Dwerten some breathing room. Most of humanity's drone aid had perished in the initial engagement, protecting life and limb over unbreathing, unfeeling metal. I was pleased that the Dwerten hadn't turned their guns on us or the UN, but I suppose even they weren't foolish enough to invite extinction. It was easy to claim that it was better not to exist than to bow to a predator's whims when that ultimatum wasn't staring an herbivore in the face. Self-preservation was an instinct that transcended all classes of life forms. With the Multi, Dresgian, and other Federation subsidiaries driven out by us, there was hope of keeping some of Kalkwa's infrastructure intact. I winced, thinking what percentage of the populace lived in the cities that had already been hit. Per my documents, the last census data suggests a population of about 6.5 billion, including foreigners on work visas or diplomatic stays. It's a smaller number than the amount of people on Earth, largely due to the constant casualties brought on by this endless war. It was important to take inventory of exactly what was transpiring around my command ship. Through the near-microscopic dots Kaisel had highlighted, I could glimpse human nanodrones on the fly. The Dwerten Shield seemed to lack a strategy with their remaining ships, with every unit operating out of independent desperation. The Yotul were being hounded by any drone that could burn toward them, and could only fend off so many guns-blazing foes, even with exemplary flying. It was obvious where our plasma support was best spent. If humanity's manned ships had taken on automatons in prior engagements, there was no reason Arxa crews couldn't hold our own too. It would reflect poorly on my abilities as a commander if we couldn't drive the Kolshians out in one fell swoop. Focus plasma on targets who are in pursuit of the Yotul. Save our missiles for any Kolshians who come for us, I ordered. Kaisel narrowed his eyes.
Understood, sir. I forwarded a handful of possible targets that are almost in range of our weapons.
Lisa looked up from her spot beside Bondarenko.
Sir, if I may, I've been informed that the Dwerten have been persuaded to charge the enemy.
All our ducks are in a row. It happens right now, all at once. We'll be throwing everything but the kitchen sink at them.
Alexei declared with a chipper grin. Everything but the kitchen sink. The idiom didn't compute with me, and I figured I could attempt to utilize human levity to build rapport with my crew. If I was going to bring Arxa back to our old ways and I couldn't learn from Vizith, it would behoove me to replicate the Terran's bedside manner. That saying does not make sense. Why would we be throwing a Forcer tool in a space battle? Is this a remark on using anything as a weapon?
Well, not that we wouldn't. You know, there were secret programs to use cats as acoustic listening devices. This saying was popularized during our Second World War, or so I hear. Anything usable went to the war effort, so I guess it took off then.
I regret ever asking to learn more about your inane rationale. Let me know if the United Nations has anything useful to impart, rather than using confusing excerpts about household appliances.
Yes, sir. It's about to get serious for sure. You could say we're about to go out of the frying pan into the fire.
You think it's funny to use this idiom after I warned you, yes? You're lucky your government would not tolerate me breaking your ankles like I did Kaisel's. The Arxa grunt winced, drawing his tail closer.
Do not remind me, sir. Given that humans must char their food, and their culture, like ours, revolves around meat-eating, it computes that kitchenware is a priceless contributor to their daily lives.
I can see why the Dwerten would be relegated to the kitchen sink. As incompetent herbivores without a shred of common sense, I do not expect their charge to be useful or deliver on its promised effects. A bunch of inadequate resources together may be enough, is that not correct? The Terrans must have completed a similar assessment in their stratagems. We are to save the herbivores and do our part, lest we look to be bumbling idiots like the Dwerten.
Understood. I'm on it.
Our weapon station was attempting to lock onto a Kolshian drone, utilizing the data that Kaisel had forwarded. Several captains in the rebel fleet were coordinating their fire, cultivating synchronicity to deal massive damage once we drew within range. The Yotul were clever enough to keep just ahead of the enemy pursuers and to slowly loop toward us in an indirect path. They were routing the Federation fleet toward us, which would make it easier to get a crack at our targets. Power was diverted away from non-essential systems aboard my command vessel, ensuring that our initial volley was sizzling with intensity. The dazzling flashes of thousands of plasma beams fired off in unison was an impressive display of control. The robots could dodge through some of the plasma, calculating the munition's intended course and abruptly twirling out of the way. However, that meant they had to ease up on their pursuit of the technocracy vessels. The Yotul were ready to bombard them with particle beams as quickly as their weaponry would allow. The Dwerten had also diverted most of their remaining ships into a formation advance and were using everything but the kitchen sink. That is, they were using whatever weapons they had left over from the prolonged engagement. Kaisel had ordered our weapon station to hold their fire and only now granted the permission to annihilate a target. With the Kolshians being pressed on all sides, our chosen target was paying no mind to any rebel fleet follow-up. I see the point of bringing the Dwerten shield forward. On their own, they pack very little claw strength, but with the drones ignoring them in favor of greater threats, they can choose their marks unimpeded. The slim number of remaining Terran drones had drifted away from the Yotul's side as we stepped into the fold. Humanity's computer-piloted fleet mobilized beside the Dwerten shield, protecting their remnants in the scarce cases they were fired upon. My best guess was that the UN didn't want the Dwerten to start sustaining heavy losses and crumble with their already frazzled nerves. The brazen charge wouldn't hold if they started dropping like prey. I waited with impatience for our plasma railguns to recharge, wanting to pin down the Kolshians before they could craft an evasion strategy. The Terran nanodrones I'd spotted on the sensors earlier zipped toward any Kolshian drones who had resumed their pursuit of the Yotul. I could see that a few dozen technocracy ships had been on the receiving end of missile barrages from the debris scattered in the void. The microscopic human automatons pounced on the enemy's lack of shielding, and I watched one swarm ram itself into a foe's thrusters. While it wasn't as decisive as a reactor strike, it was enough to immobilize the drone. A Dwerten shield vessel moseyed in to mop it up, as even those foolish avians could take down a paralyzed target. Kaisel, how many more drones do you expect we need to kill before their algorithms recognize they've lost? I asked. Lisa shifted on her feet.
If I may interject, I think it's not so simple. The Shadow Fleet has the kind of numbers that losses aren't their concern. Should the algorithms assess that the battle is lost, I imagine they'll shift their focus to taking out as many souls on Kalkua as possible before going down. This has always been about teaching the Dwerten a lesson.
Their aim was to engineer the complete eradication of the species that defied them, so I cannot argue against your conclusion. My question to the runt, to Kaisel stands. What's the number where it's decided that all is lost? The scrawny Arxer lashed his tail.
In my estimation, we have already crossed that threshold, sir. Between the Yotul, us, and the Dwerten shield scoring kills, I count 6,500 fallen enemies. If there's anything the Kalimari wanted to try, they have to make that push while they still have numbers.
I squinted at the viewport, assessing where a push might come from. Several Shadow Fleet drones had ramped up the pressure on technocracy vessels, despite understanding it left them vulnerable to the three species covering the Yotul. Another contingent was feinting toward the Dwerten homeworld, knowing full well that the Terrans would ram automatons into their foes if needed to stop them from drawing close enough. The final break-off group I spotted was waltzing into our crosshairs, right into the waiting missiles that we'd conserved to avoid such a head-on assault. Between all of those ostensible last-ditch efforts, there was a small number of hostiles that were unaccounted for. With the Dwerten closing in on the Kolshians from the planet's direction, the Terrans functioning as a middleman, and us backing up the Yotulan headings from the system's outer bounds, that left a single avenue of possibility. The only path to slip away was to blaze off horizontally while locking the other engagements into a limited area. It was difficult to detect which direction they would have chosen, with the craft having escaped visual range. Debris, course data, and a slew of active weapons were drowning out sensor leads in a sea of information. Rather than allowing the Kolshians to dilute our senses, we needed to filter out the irrelevant matters. I hurried over to the sensor station to preside over the full array and moved Kaisel out of the way without explanation. Despite grasping that it would leave us blind to a target lock, I switched off all data correlating to in-flight weapons. My next subset to subtract was anything less than half of a ship length, even though that would entail manual spotting to avoid flying into debris or friendly nanodrones. It still remained difficult to pass a particular group of renegades from their buddies, so I resorted to removing all vessels which had been marked as friendly. It was less than ideal to not know our partners' vectors on top of not viewing their weapons' trajectories. However, if my theory was correct, we had little time to mitigate the Shadow Fleet's plan to double the casualties on Calqua. I pointed with the claw to faint energy readings. Peel back. See these readings here? The Shadow Fleet snuck some ships off that way to bomb Calqua. Send our fastest craft after them.
I'll send word to the United Nations.
Lisa chimed in.
They'll be responsible for filling in the Dwerten's shield, who I'm sure have been so pleasant to work with.
Alexei narrowed his eyes.
I'll tell the Yotol, though I don't imagine they'll have a hope of intersecting ships that are closer to us. We have to stop the squids. Each drone probably only has one antimatter bomb aboard, but if there's a few hundred ships, that's...
We do learn arithmetic on RIS, contrary to common beliefs. That would induce more city hits than they've already racked up in the sum of the battle. Over 1 billion more dead. Unlike Calsim's fools, the Kolshians have been strategic enough to take out key military strongholds and seats of government across Calqua already, so now it'll be pure population.
The Dwerten will have a fraction of their former power. As is, they may lose the deciding stake in their shield alliance.
Lisa postulated.
That might be for the best, except that they're a driving force in hating the Federation. Plus their manufacturing capacity is second to none in their little group.
We cannot afford to lose virtually all of their major urban centers, yes? The fastest ships in the rebel fleet have already received a communique to pursue this vector, but we will trail behind to supervise. Divert all power to propulsion. Kaisel squinted.
With respect, sir, we cannot hope to catch them in a ship of our size. I do not know that our speediest vessels can catch them.
I did not specify thrusters. Lisa, your job is to get us in touch with the Dwerten shield through the UN. Charge our warp drive through the standard stationary protocol, and coordinate a fraction of a second for us to warp to their intended destination. My hope is that we are in and out before the Kolshians notice the opportunity. Get a small enough number of our other warships to jump at the same time, but not enough that the drones notice we're prepping for warp and become wise to it. Peacekeeper Reynolds ducked her head.
I'm on it, sir. I'll coordinate with navigations.
Pardon my audacity for asking questions, Domineering Chief Hunter. But if we're catching up through FTL, why are you sending the speediest ships after them at sublight velocities?
The Oxarunt spoke up. It's a mere diversion, Kaisel, so that they think we're going after them in that hopeless fashion. I paced back to the captain's station, allowing him to resume full control over the sensors hub. What do the prey accuse us of so often? It's a ruse. The gravity disturbances off the FTL disruptors were preventing warp travel now. If the Kolshians realized that they'd have an opportunity to slip into subspace, that would allow them to poke their units directly through to orbital range. It was quintessential that they wouldn't have the slightest clue of our intentions, and that the field was reasserted as soon as it was opened. This might mean we'd be thrown back into real space the hard way, but despite the unpleasant variables, this was the only hope of catching the Calqua-bound bomb-toters. It was a necessary gambit for the continuance of the Dwerten as a galactic power. This entire rescue mission was a pointless waste of resources if this doesn't succeed, beyond the senseless loss of life that would mirror an Axa raid. I hope to never see a planet come to that again, so this must work. As we stalled in position, protected at the far reaches of the rebel fleet, I watched the warp drive uncoil suitably to chart a path. If I had time to process what was unfolding, I might have even been nervous despite my immense battle experience. However, it was over before I realized it had started. My command ship lurched into subspace before our violet expulsion as the disruptors went back up near instantaneously. In that sliver of time which was imperceptible to any life form, we'd punched our ticket ahead of the Shadow Fleet's path. Our warship could stand in the path of the incoming bomb-bearing foes. The havoc the FTL disruptors wreaked in our biology wasn't something that could be trained away. The sudden transition confounded the senses. The skin wrapped around my brain felt too tight. My ears bore the sensation of being turned inside out as deafening bells rang within. My body temperature was climbing like I was under a sun lamp, and my eyes were projecting psychedelic patterns onto everything I saw. An unspeakable level of vertigo made it difficult to think, let alone direct my equally dazed soldiers to battle stations. The humans had turned flushed shades of red and were on the floor struggling to coordinate movements. A growl rumbled in my throat as I leaned against my station with the full force of my weight. "Divert! Power! Back to weapons!" I huffed. "Move!" A weapons technician slumped against the buttons, managing to move a paw that weighed a ton to the needed buttons. He collapsed with exhaustion after completing the sequence, and I swiveled my slowly normalizing vision back to Kaisel. The Oxa runt was on his knees. Judging by the concerned look in his eyes, he couldn't read the overlay. I tried to consult my own, but the dots all bled together through the blur. My eyelids squeezed shut in merciful darkness for a few seconds, and I sucked in measured breaths. My gaze snapped back open with renewed focus, allowing me to gauge the situation. The Kolshian drones were mere seconds from arriving, so I hoped that my crew could shake off the FTL disruptor's effect in the next few moments. To my surprise, there were a small handful of Terran drones and Dwerten shield vessels that had made the jump with us, forsaking their counterparts for the good of Kalkwa. At least the friendly automatons couldn't be shaken by the transitional effects on biologics. The rebels on my bridge got their tails back into motion and tended to the now-ready plasma railgun. We had to throw everything we had at the Shadow Fleet. I straightened with pride, despite how much that Segway had taken out of me. Oxa are the finest warriors in the galaxy. We stopped them here. We stopped the Federation here. Confident growls echoed across the bridge as my followers tapped into their strength reserves. The Dwerten shield still looked a bit listless, so their fire might be a bit behind our initial volley. Kaisel zoomed in on a Kolshian drone, and with startling efficiency, our plasma weapon fired. Two other rebel friendlies targeted the same vessel from different angles, making evasion improbable. The automaton fired off a desperate stream of missiles before it was blasted into oblivion. Terran robots deployed a stream of interceptors to neutralize that parting gift. I didn't wait for the light of the reactor explosion to die down before ordering weapons to unleash the missiles that we'd been preserving to save our own hides. The meandering Dwerten shield caught on enough to dump every missile they had at the oncoming enemies, since that was an easy task to complete. Terran drones forged ahead of us, cruising along vectors that put them on collision courses. Despite the contentious resistance, the Federation were getting close to orbital range of Kalkwa. The fractional contingent of craft we warped here had put a swift end to the few hundred Shadow Fleet bogies. I never thought I'd be fighting side by side with leaf-licking apes and the Dwerten shield, I muttered to myself before bellowing orders at a pitch where my crew could hear. However fast is the quickest you can get that plasma gun online. I want it done faster. Throw everything but the kitchen sink at them. If we have it in stock, use it. Zhao will definitely have to afford us some maintenance and restocking after this escapade. Our resources are limited and now depleted. Our interceptors were repurposed to be hurled at the drones, hoping that anything that landed would hinder their approach. The Dwerten shield had finally brought their plasma guns alive and were spitting off beams in defense of Kalkwa. The Shadow Fleet dispensed shield-breaking missiles of their own across our joint line before returning another round of plasma tailored toward the Dwerten ships. I saw that, with the small number of ships we had in their way, our enemy intended to push through our weakest link. 3 craft might fall, but one making it through would lend consolation to them. There had been a negligible number of Terran drones to protect the Dwerten from their folly, and the Oxa rebel fleet was otherwise occupied with targets of our own. After running the mental math in my head, it was clear to me that we couldn't stop every planet-bound vessel alone. We had to handle what was in front of us. Due to the efforts I'd led, my forces were cutting down 200-odd ships that would have ravaged the planet. It spared Kalkwa the majority of the damage, but despite our heroic victory approaching certainty, it wasn't possible here to save the homogeneity from a few final losses. The Dwerten shield failed to hold their defensive line, and the Kolshian drones broke through the final stretch to orbital range above the inhabited world. The Dwerten pivoted in desperation, with a few desperate enough to save their loved ones that they mimicked the actions of the Terran drones, ramming into the bombers. Though most hostiles became easy pickings due to taking no actions to protect themselves. About 6 enemies made it through to their destination. Plasma beams and missiles struck true against the genocidal metal hunks, but it was too late. The shield tossed kinetics at the antimatter payloads, hoping against hope to strike the fast-moving warheads, yet knowing it wouldn't work. In rote silence, my claws switched onto the comms channel to hear the Yotol declaring they were cleaning up the last remaining Kolshian hostiles back at the warp point. A dark part of my soul almost admired how the Shadow Fleet sacrificed thousands in a losing battle to increase their casualty count. Our intervention had saved the Dwerten from total extinction, and it was an effort that would garner respect from the United Nations. It remained to be seen how this would affect relations between the homogeneity and the Sapient Coalition, but it might even open the birds' minds to cordial relations. However, as 60-plus antimatter bombs delved into Kalkra's atmosphere, I couldn't feel any sense of triumph. Today was another bleak mark in the Federation's bloodstained history in this galaxy.